Good afternoon and welcome to Hudson Institute. I'm Rachel Mackey, and along with our president and CEO at Hudson Institute, John Walters, I direct Hudson Institute Political Studies. And I just wanted to welcome you all here to Hudson Institute and thank you for the time that you've spent with us at this wonderful conference. It's been an honor to co-sponsor this event with the LeFrak Forum, and I just wanted to thank Dustin Stiebel and Zachary Bennett for bringing all of you and this fantastic event to Hudson. For those of you who don't know very much about Hudson Institute Political Studies, what we try to do is offer an education in the theory and practice of politics, all the way from big questions like who is Nietzsche and does religion still exist, to what is justice, to how should that inform our own time and our own place. And this is one in many events and educational programs that we offer. And so I encourage you to just take a look at all of our offerings. And I hope that this is the first of many times that we'll see you here at Hudson Institute. Without further time taken away from our illustrious guest, Raul.
Thank you again to Rachel Mackey and John Walters and the Hudson Institute for allowing us to, LeFrak, to come and give this conference on Nietzsche. It's been a real pleasure to be here so far, and I'm sure a lot of our guests here and at home have appreciated the time that everybody's taken to be here. Again, my name is Raul Rodriguez, and I have the honor and privilege of introducing our speaker, Dr. Heinrich Meier. I'll make my introduction very short so that Dr. Meyer has sufficient time to give his lecture and then also to have questions and respond to those questions. We haven't had as much time during the Q&A, so I think it'll be important after this very important lecture to have time for questions. Dr. Meyer is Director Emeritus of the Carl Friedrich von Siemens Foundation in Munich, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Munich, and Permanent Visiting Professor in the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. Dr. Meyer has several groundbreaking and provocative books, which I recommend to all of you. And most recently, he has 2 books on Nietzsche. What is Nietzsche's Zarathustra? A philosophical confrontation, which just came out. And Nietzsche's Legacy, Ecce Homo and the Antichrist, 2 books on nature and politics. So I highly recommend that you get these books. They're very, as I said, groundbreaking and provocative. Both are with the University of Chicago Press. Now, Dr. Meyer is a world-renowned scholar and a powerful teacher, and I know this through experience. A few years ago, Dr. Meyer was gracious enough to allow me to audit his courses on Leo Strauss. These courses, along with his scholarship, have profoundly challenged me to think in new and deeper ways. One may not always agree with Dr. Meyer's conclusions, but the force and logic of his arguments provoke one to reconsider previously held beliefs. Some of the most important conversations I have had about philosophy and faith have included a discussion of the ideas articulated by Dr. Meyer. I owe him a great debt of gratitude, as do many others. We all now have the opportunity to witness the profundity and clarity of Dr. Meyer's thought. The title of his lecture is Nietzsche's Will to Power and the Self-Knowledge of the Philosopher. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Meyer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rodriguez, for your kind words, and thank you very much for the invitation to Dr. Stiebel. Nietzsche's will to power is surrounded by legends and overlaid by interpretations that impede access to Nietzsche's thought to an unusual degree. To an unusual degree because the will to power has in common with other doctrines that when the philosophical doctrine becomes independent, that is, as soon as it unfolds a broader effect and is received into the stock of tradition, it becomes a hurdle to understanding the intention underlying it. In the case of Nietzsche's will to power, there is the additional problem that long prevailing interpretations and legends, which continue to determine the reception in various ways, have their crystallizing kernel in a supposed major work entitled The Will to Power that does not at all correspond to Nietzsche's intention. The compilation published in 1901, a year after Nietzsche's burial, and extended by several hundred pages in a second version in 1906, contributed significantly to the idea that Nietzsche's philosophy culminated in the teaching of the will to power. It was simply not granted to the author to elaborate it in a valid form. The most influential interpretation of the doctrine according to which the will to power is supposed to designate Nietzsche's Metaphysics is not by coincidence closely connected to the legend that what is most important, what is philosophically essential, is to be found only in Nietzsche's Nachlass. Nietzsche, the legend tells us, did not get to say what he had to say and what he ultimately wanted to say. The compilers of The Will to Power chose, as the conclusion of their work, a text in which the speaking I evokes its Dionysian world of eternally creating oneself, of eternally destroying oneself, and asks the readers or listeners, do you want a name for this world, a solution for all its riddles, a light also for you, you most hidden, strongest, most unafraid, most midnightly ones? The answer, separated from the staccato of questions by only a dash, reads, this world is the will to power and nothing besides, and you yourselves are also this will to power and nothing besides. The literal last work of the volume, called The Will to Power, two succinct sentences, each furnished with an exclamation mark, seems to be clear. There is one will to power. It is everything that we know, and we are nothing other than this very will. An authoritative confirmation of Nietzsche's metaphysics, or as one or another interpreter mindful of the emphatic critique that Nietzsche levels against metaphysics may say more cautiously, a pithy expression of Nietzsche ontology. What is will to power. A name, a solution, a light. Yet when a philosopher promises the solution to all the world's riddles, we do well to ask in what persona he is speaking, to whom he is addressing himself, and which audience he has in view. Not in Elisabeth Förster-Nietzsche's and Peter Gast's The Will to Power, but in Nietzsche's Nachlass, there is another pithy note that is suitable for throwing light on his so-called ontology. Quote, exoteric, esoteric. First, everything is will against will. Second, there is no will at all. We do not know at which place, in which constellation, as part of which speech, Nietzsche would have used the text that the compilers elevated into the last word of the will to power. If he even would have used it and not simply discarded it. For what we do know is that the note dates from the summer of 1885. Nietzsche decided against including it in Beyond Good and Evil, and he did not incorporate it into any of the 6 books that he subsequently published or made ready for printing. We touch here on a fundamental problem of Heidegger's Nietzsche interpretation. which gives precedence to the Nachlass. Heidegger was not unaware of the unreliability of the posthumous edition. How could the obvious deficiencies of a dilettantish publication pass unremarked, one which mixes highly disparate notes from across a period of 7 years, tears apart what belongs together, places what does not belong together side by side, does not distinguish authentic passages from excerpts and prints in large numbers, redundant fragments, drafts, and preliminary studies for texts that Nietzsche himself presented in polished form and with careful arrangement in his books. Whoever compares, for example, the so-called posthumous aphorisms on Socrates that are transmitted by the will to power to the chapter The Problem of Socrates, which Nietzsche published on the basis of the same material in 1888 in the Twilight of the Idols, can gauge the distance that separates a collection of notes from a book of Nietzsche's. Regardless of his criticism of the Nachlass edition, Heidegger insisted on the priority of the posthumous notes as the authentic approach to Nietzsche's philosophy. The Nietzsche preferred by Heidegger is an author of sketches and maxims, or more pointedly said, a purveyor of pre-Socratic fragments that put up much less resistance to the interpreter's will to power than do books constructed with deliberation, laid out artfully, and governed by a central intention. Thus, Heidegger, to name an example that is more than an example, comes to assert Nietzsche's inverted Platonism by reference to the Nachlass, and with the support of a chapter of barely 1.5 pages, which he detaches from the context of the book and into which he inserts his own terminology. Nietzsche has accomplished a reversal of the fundamental metaphysical position, but he has retained the Platonic so-called formal structure, Baugestalt, of upper and lower, when he, as Heidegger says, set the sensible world against the supersensible one. That, quote, the overturning of Platonism would have to become a twisting out of it, Nietzsche recognized only in his last creative year, 1888, unquote. In other words, Nietzsche saw or divined that another beginning was required, but it remained for Heidegger to draw the conclusions from the end of metaphysics. Nietzsche's answer to Platonism is supposed to be located on the level of metaphysics. Had Heidegger given Beyond Good and Evil, in which Nietzsche presents the sharpest critique of Platonism, the attention that the book demands, he would have been able to see that Nietzsche's answer to the two inventions with which he charges Platonism in the preface, the pure spirit and the good in itself, is reflected in the book's structure. In the centers of the two unequal halves into which the fourth main part divides Beyond Good and Evil stand the main parts, the free spirit and our virtues. Against the double dogmatist's error of Platonism, Nietzsche deploys a type that he characterizes according to its virtues. He confronts Platonism not with a metaphysical teaching, but on the path of the philosopher's self-determination. The flip side of augmenting the value of the Nachlass is diminishing the value of the books in which Nietzsche presented his philosophy. It was not without reason that he furnished the third and by far longest chapter of Ecce Homo with the heading, Why I Write Such Good Books, and not Why I Write Such Good Notes. The diminution of value results in neglect. This goes especially for the books that sealed the end of the Will to Power project. The Twilight of the Idols, which Nietzsche in large part mined from the Will to Power papers when he rejected the old plans, and The Diet of Ecce Homo and the Antichrist, which according to Nietzsche's direction was supposed to take the Will to Power's place. With the Antichrist, Ecce Homo declares the revaluation of all values to be completed. That the concluding double work was not comprehended in its cohesiveness for more than a century, to say nothing of its philosophical significance being recognized, is also a result of the fixation on the Nachlass. It is not the least of the collateral damage done by the legend of the major work which the Nietzsche archive fostered and which nourished that fixation. As regards the teaching of the Will to Power, it is one thing, the compilation of the same name is another. To inform us about the concept and its scope, Nietzsche's books, in which, if I see correctly, the term occurs 47 times, are sufficient. It appears most frequently 16 times in Beyond Good and Evil, where the range of usages stretches from an antidote provided by the diagnostician of the age who attributes to his epoch weakness of will, to the proposition offered by the psychologist and physiologist that the will to power is the one basic form of the will from which the whole life of our drives is to be explained. In an ironic turn of phrase in the same passage, Nietzsche sets out to define and denominate the intelligible character, in quotation marks, of the world as will to power, again in quotation marks, and nothing besides. That nothing besides is the only thing which remained from that famous, infamous aphorism. The posthumous notes inform us about the extensions, coarsenings, and refinements of the doctrine which Nietzsche considered. But in order to penetrate to the teaching's philosophic core, to fix one's eye and reflect on what is most importantly at issue with the will to power, we are by no means dependent on the Nachlass. We get a view of what is most important when, in modifying a maxim from Beyond Good and Evil, we pursue the question of what the ontological or metaphysical or theological doctrine of a philosopher means when it is applied to him, i.e., when it is seen as a means of his self-understanding, when it is comprehended as a tool of self-knowledge. To clarify this question, it is advisable to pay attention to how the concept is introduced, in what place and for what purpose the doctrine is originally deployed. Nietzsche delegated the introduction of the concept to his son, Zarathustra. It was never used before. The will to power is part of the large-scale attempt at self-understanding and self-ascertainment, at collecting and dividing what belongs to the philosopher and what is not compatible with him, which Nietzsche undertook in the 4 parts of his book, For All and None. An experiment that kept him in suspense for 3 full years, and whose results he released for printing step by step. Whenever he had finished a part, he published it and only then wrote the following part. Very important fact. Zarathustra speaks of the will to power for the first time in the speech of the 1,000 Goals and One, in which the first part reaches its political philosophical peak. Zarathustra calls the table of goods that hangs over every people the table of its, that is, of this people's overcomings, quote, the voice of its will to power. The will to power initially appears as a will to self-enhancement. It expresses itself in the ends of valuations along with the associated commandments and prohibitions that are supposed to bring about this enhancement politically. The will to power, understood as a will to self-enhancement and self-overcoming, has a critical potential. It is a concept of distinction. In the second speech of the three speeches in which Zarathustra uses the term, he no longer speaks about the people's will to power, but about the will to power of the wisest. The contemplation of politics as a whole is followed by an elucidation of the philosopher in particular. On self-overcoming, the central speech on the will to power, in which 7 of the 9 usages of the will to power fall, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is expressly addressed to the wisest, to them whom he addresses 7 times as you wisest ones. Zarathustra propounds the teaching of life as will to power. He requests of them seriously to test his word, which stands in the center of the speech. Quote, where I found the living, there I found will to power, and even in the will of the one who serves, I found the will to be master. That the weaker should serve the stronger, of this it is persuaded by its will, which wants to be master over what is still weaker. This pleasure alone it does not want to dispense with. If the wisest ones are to test Zarathustra's word, it is not only or first of all a matter of investigating whether he has with his teaching solved the riddle of life. What he suggests to them is that they reflect on whether they recognize themselves in it with regard to what is most important to them. For Zarathustra's speech deals with the will to truth from its very first verse. Zarathustra had introduced the will to truth 10 speeches before and translated it into the demand, quote, that everything be transformed into what is thinkable for man, visible to man, feelable by man. Your own senses you shall think to the end. Zarathustra holds against the wisest that what they call their will to truth is a will to the thinkability of all beings without their giving themselves an account of it, thus running the risk of misunderstanding the active role of their senses, of their feeling, seeing, thinking of themselves. A misunderstanding that leads to the narrowing of the thinkability of all beings into the conformation of all beings to the spirit to which they must fit and bend themselves. Thus your will wills it, smooth shall it become, and subject to the spirit as its mirror and reflected image. Their will creates the world according to their image, the image that they themselves make of themselves, the idea of the spirit that is supposed to rule in them and in all beings. In the place where the thinkability of all beings is at question, in the sense of their being assimilated to the spirit's representations, or else in accordance with the necessity of their resistance or recalcitrance, Zarathustra introduces the will to power into the treatment of the knower, as the philosopher is called in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He does it beginning from the will to truth and with a critical intention. The teaching of life as will to power, which Zarathustra propounds to the wisest in order to promote their self-knowledge, culminates in a speech in which Zarathustra helps life itself to speak its word. At the beginning, life makes itself known to Zarathustra as God made himself known to Moses. But in contrast to the theologomenon of the Sinai, life's word points to the necessity that inheres in it and makes knowledge possible. Behold, I am that which must always overcome itself. In the center of its 10-verse speech, life attesting Zarathustra's teaching and lending emphasis to his intention refers to the will to truth, which stands at the very center of interest for the philosopher. Whatever I create and however much I love it, soon I must be adversary to it and to my love. Thus my will wills it, and you too, knower, are only a pathway and footstep of my will. Verily, my will to power also walks on the feet of your will to truth. It is the last mention of the will to truth in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The doctrine's critical capacity is brought to bear in the chapter on redemption, for which Zarathustra's last discussion of the will to power is reserved. The will to power is mentioned by name only once, in the last verse of Zarathustra's speech. But the speech, which marks the drama's peripeteia, continuously has the will to power as its subject, which, with its aberrations and perversions, its foolishness, the Unmut, anger, in which it manifests itself, the spirit of revenge, to which it gives birth. The spirit of revenge is mentioned only in the speech twice. The will to power's Unmut is ignited by that which precedes the will and against which the will's power fails, which was before it wills. Its revenge is the expression of a lack of power, an evasion and diversion made by the will, which revolts in vain against necessity. Zarathustra speaks of the great folly that dwells in our will, and which, enhanced into the spirit of revenge, has, quote, so far been man's best reflection. The revenge of the will that became aware of its powerlessness moralized the world. The suffering that aroused its Unmut was construed as punishment and thus subjugated to justice. The place of justice toward the world, toward life, toward the self, which the knower seeks to achieve in the sense of an adequacy of the to the subject matter, is taken by justice of the moral world order, which is supposed to be ruled by an intention and to guarantee a meaning. The spirit of revenge contrives a moral law to which it subjects the innocence of becoming, or a higher will through which it can establish an order that the will is not capable of creating through its own power. The spirit of revenge designates a dysfunctionality of the will to power in regard to the will to truth. It stands for that which the philosopher in particular must be on guard against if he does not want to falsify the world, do violence to the phenomena, and misunderstand himself. The insight into the will to power's dysfunctionality is closely connected with Zarathustra's self-reflection, which makes on redemption the turning point of the book. For Zarathustra, who with his promise of the great midday has gotten into a deep crisis through the words of the great in vain, all is empty, all is alike, all was, and who is hence shaken in his tense future-directedness, Zarathustra recognizes the untenability of the futurist teaching of the overman. The attempt to overcome the giant accident, to bring about the turning point in time, to unite mankind through one goal in order to redeem it from the, quote, nonsense, the senselessness that has so far prevailed over it, this endeavor is for its part an expression of a will to power misguided by moral indignation, determined by the noble affect. Zarathustra must admit to himself that the now and formerly on earth is what is most unbearable to him. He must admit to being overwhelmed by his dissatisfaction with the world as it is. The teacher of redemption, who praises the will as the great liberator and joy-bringer, quote, would not know how to live if he were not also a seer of that which must come. The redemption is in the future. He takes revenge on the it was of time against which his will recoils, that is, on the past of mankind, which escapes his rulership by making it needy for redemption, and with it all who were before him, who are present, and who will be after him. The will to power, it is obvious, must turn back on itself. It must become reflexive. It must look itself in the eye in the spirit of revenge, comprehend the Unmut as its ill will, in order to be able to overcome the perversion, to resist the aberration. For the philosopher, everything depends on the will's being unharnessed, as Zarathustra says, from its foolishness. Zarathustra used unharnessed before this. It is the only other usage in the speech on the exalted ones. It immediately follows the speech in which he pointed out to the wisest the will to power in their will to truth. Zarathustra speaks to the heroes of knowledge, who in their hunt for knowledge become fixated on themselves and do not understand how to be exalted above their seriousness and their tense directedness. To them, whom he has called penitents in spirit, he calls out, to stand with relaxed muscles and unharnessed will, that is what is most difficult for you all. Just as for the will of the hero, the harness of cruelty toward oneself elevated into an end, not understood, as Nietzsche understands it, as a means, had to be removed if it was to ascend to the composed freedom and serene cheerfulness of the over-hero, only mentioned at this place. So the will to power of the knower must be unhitched from the harness that makes it blindly pull and rush in the vain urge to become master of everything, to break time and to compel necessity. That's his foolishness, or its foolishness. The will to power is not the solution, but the core of the problem for the philosopher. The central statement in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, that the will to power is at work in the will to truth, has a critical sense. And in fact, in Nietzsche's poem, the conception turns out not to be a means of persuading the noble addressees, but an instrument of Zarathustra's self-critique. In Beyond Good and Evil, the first book in which Nietzsche again speaks in his own name after the years of the Zarathustra experiment, the will to power is the only one of the three concepts introduced by Zarathustra, overman, will to power, eternal return, that Nietzsche takes up explicitly. The concept receives additional valences, the teaching is expanded, while the philosophical core undergoes an emphatic confirmation. The will to power's inner tension, which Zarathustra had in view, is discussed in aphorism 230 with a clarity not achieved anywhere else. The philosophical argument unfolded by Beyond Good and Evil reaches its peak in the aphorism, which belongs to the seventh main part, our virtues. For the third and final time, the book's preeminent addressee is mentioned by name, the free, very free spirits. They previously appeared one time each in the preface and in the second main part, the free spirit. Their mention connects the three parts of the book that marks out Nietzsche's answer to Platonism, preface, part 2, part 7. Nietzsche does not use the term will to power in aphorism 230, yet he speaks of nothing else, dividing it into two conflicting wills. In the first step, he goes back to a basic will of the spirit which seeks to become master of the world by comprehending and appropriating, interpreting and incorporating, but enforcing its dominance and succumbing to self-deception misses the truth. He takes as his starting point the, quote, commanding something that is called the spirit by the people, unquote, and presents it as a will that ties up, subdues, thirsts for rule, and is actually ruling. The basic will of the spirit, as Zarathustra has life teach in his central speech on the will to power, is one with the will that is at work in life generally. Quote, the spirit's strength to appropriate the foreign reveals itself in a strong inclination to assimilate the new to the old, to simplify the manifold, to overlook or repulse that which is entirely contradictory, just as it more strongly underscores, accentuates, falsifies into shape at will certain features and lines of the foreign of every piece of external world. Like life, the basic will of the spirit is intent on growth, quote, more specifically on the feeling of growth, on the feeling of increased strength. The same will is served, as Nietzsche stresses, by a seemingly opposed drive of the spirit, a sudden resolve for ignorance, a shutting of one's windows, a kind of defensive condition against much that is knowable, a contentment with the dark, with a closing off horizon, even the occasional will to let oneself be deceived. The contentment with the dark, with the closing off horizon, we can also designate as a stopping at conviction, as settling down in faith. The basic will of the spirit and of life, the will to seeming and surface, to simplification and assimilation, is countered in the second step by, quote, that sublime inclination of the knower from Zarathustra, who takes and wants to take things deeply, multiply, thoroughly, as a kind of cruelty of the intellectual conscience and taste. In the knower, the basic will turns back to itself. A bifurcation of the will to power takes place, in which the will to the surface encounters the will to thoroughness. Or the one ruling will must, as soon as the knower is involved, split itself into the will that wants to become master of the world and the will that wants to become master of itself. In the concluding double work, Ecce Homo and the Antichrist, Nietzsche will go back to the passion of knowledge as the despotic and enlightened passion in the philosopher's nature in order to grasp the bifurcation. The advantage of this conception is that both strands are compellingly related to each other, intertwine and enhance each other, since in it, the knowledge of the world and self-knowledge necessarily have one goal, knowledge. Instead of this, the two steps in aphorism 230, which follow each other, but are turned against each other, emphasize the need of probity for the knower as sharply as it can be emphasized, without therefore deviating from the course followed since dawn, that one has to go back to the nature of the philosopher. On the contrary, Nietzsche, who introduced probity in the center of the seventh main part as the virtue which alone remained to us, makes precisely this virtue into the touchstone and example of the return to nature. It is supposed to be shown in our nature as the knower's cruelty toward himself, in his nature, not in the 19th century. Certainly, it would sound more courteous, Nietzsche admits, if instead of cruelty we were said, whispered, reputed, to have, for instance, an excessive probity. We free, very free spirits. This is the third and last mentioning of this addressee. As for the virtues, distinctions, and comia conferred on the philosophers, it can be said in general, quote, probity, love of truth, love of wisdom, sacrifice for knowledge, heroism of the truthful. There is something in this that makes one's pride swell. The philosophers whom Nietzsche is addressing can dispense with such sociable pomp and moral finery. They see their task in translating man back into nature and want, quote, to become master over the many vain and enthusiastic interpretations and secondary senses that have hitherto been scrawled and painted over the eternal basic text Homo Natura, for all who call Nietzsche an historicist. The basic will of the spirit, which wants to be master and wants to feel itself as master, is not in itself sufficient for this task, since the scrawlings and paintings over are essentially its work. For the basic text to be able to be uncovered from the interpretations that conceal it, attention must first be directed to the interpreter and the interpretive activity. This is why Nietzsche shines such bright light on the will to power in the will to truth, or on the basic will of the spirit, which coarsely misrepresents reality. Its being known is the precondition of its being steered. If the philosopher does not comprehend his will to power as a problem, if he does not, to speak once again with Zarathustra, unharness it from its foolishness, rein in its unmut, oppose the spirit of revenge, if he does not subject the basic will of the spirit to his insight, the philosopher's will to truth will miss its aim, the truth. In Beyond Good and Evil and on the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche brings the will to power's critical potential to the fore. Furthermore, he makes it the bearer of a developmental teaching that has its vanishing point in the philosopher's highest activity as the most spiritual will to power. Besides this, he makes polemical use of the concept against the prevailing opinions and mentalities that conflict with an aristocratic renewal. Finally, he brings it into play, tentatively sounding out the possibilities in order to interweave everything from physics to philosophy by means of one concept. Out of this, there could have emerged the imposing system that Nietzsche's disciples later expected of him, or in any case, the comprehensive doctrine, if not the metaphysics, at least the ontology, to which Nietzscheans and anti-Nietzscheans even today want to commit and trace back Nietzsche's philosophy. Nietzsche himself provided nourishment to such expectations and conjectures when he announced on the cover of 1886 Beyond Good and Evil and in the penultimate aphorism of 1887's On the Genealogy of Morals that he was preparing a work under the title The Will to Power, attempt at a revaluation of all values. In which direction could the metaphysical or ontological extension of the will to power teaching have gone? Seen from the perspective of Beyond Good and Evil and On the Genealogy of Morals, two options emerge. Nietzsche could have used the posthumous notes concerning the will to power in accordance with an experimental philosophy, or he could have distilled from them an aristocrat's metaphysics. The experimental philosophy practices changing perspectives. It casts doubt on the self-evident, which is unquestioningly accepted, and challenges tradition, whose petrification it wants to break apart. It dares the unheard of and is willing to shake the most hallowed beliefs. It provides nourishment to curiosity and promotes further thinking through the surprising formation of a hypothesis or arrangement of an experiment. In the philosophy of attempting and of tempting, the will to power opens up a different view of the world. It belongs to the dangerous perhapses, the considerations of the suppose that, the what if questions that Nietzsche places before himself and others. Here they are directed against a world ruled by laws, that everything and everyone, from elementary particles to men, have to obey equally. Against a worldview that constantly assumes compulsion and freedom in which a hidden lawgiver reigns or must be imagined, a world into which morality is inserted. Perhaps everywhere and always only will acts on will. Suppose that everything from the stone to the state consists of processes and structures of power quanta. What if the laws were absent, and instead every power quantum drew its ultimate consequence in every moment? Nietzsche played out this alternative interpretation, which Beyond Good and Evil briefly outlines, in ever new approaches in the Nachlass. In the spring of 1888, for example, he considers what the result would be if we eliminate as, quote, added ingredients the concept of number, the concept of the subject, and the concept of motion, through which our psychology enters into the phenomena. In this case, notes Nietzsche, no things remain, but dynamic quanta, in a relation of tension toward all other dynamic quanta, whose essence consists in their relationship toward all other quanta, in their effect on them, the will to power, not a being, not a becoming, but a pathos, is the most elementary fact, out of which a becoming and effect first arises. In this experiment, the will to power is not one thing or one will to power. It does not stand for the metaphysical ground of the world. It is supposed to be a, literally quoted, characteristic. It designates a quality that is attributed to every power quantum. From the posthumous notes, however, imagination can easily derive another usage of the will to power. Nietzsche may have been tempted to present under the title The Will to Power a kind of aristocrat's metaphysics, a doctrine that would be addressed preeminently to the noble addressees, intended to encourage them, to give them a good conscience, to induce them to exert their forces to the utmost. The distinction between the philosophic and the noble addressees, because there are two addressees, is of great importance for Nietzsche's books after the periogoge, which manifests itself in the turn away from his youthful idealism and marks the beginning of the philosophic life. The distinction is of fundamental importance, for thus spoke Zarathustra. In Beyond Good and Evil, it not only determines the rhetoric of the book as a whole. The last main section, What is Noble, leaves no doubt that the noble ones to whom Nietzsche speaks in a special way are in need of the closing of horizon which the philosopher must transgress, and that the philosopher's curiosity is not compatible with nobility. Above all, it makes clear that the noble addressees have need of faith. Their faith could have been nourished by a comprehensive doctrine that would strengthen them in the opinion that their valuations corresponded to the innermost essence of the world, that their will to rulership was born by the will that governs everything. In a word, that their politics were in harmony with what is usually called metaphysics. Statements from the note, which the compilers placed at the end of The Will to Power, could have been expanded into such a metaphysics. Also, maxims like the following, which are found in the 1906 publication of Nietzsche's sister and his disciple. Quote, "The will to power can only express itself against resistances. It seeks that which resists it. Appropriation and incorporation is above all a wanting to overwhelm, a forming and shaping and reshaping until finally the overwhelmed thing has passed over entirely into the power of the attacker and has increased him." Different quote, "To stamp the character of being upon becoming, this is the highest will to power." One of the favorite quotations of Heidegger's. Since Nietzsche did not write the book, it remains open what use he would have made of the material, what selection he would have chosen, what qualifications he would have imposed, by what arguments, objections, and question marks he would have undermined the doctrine for the aristocrats of the future. Already in the books published during his lifetime, Nietzsche undermined the will to power doctrine. Beginning with Beyond Good and Evil and for the last time in Twilight of the Idols, he stresses that the will is a unity only as a word, a name, not an entity. This alone could have sufficed to counteract the elevation of the will to power into a metaphysical principle. For this, there was no need of the directness of the esoteric statement, there is no will at all. The experimental philosophy, too, which does not want to have anything to do with a one will, with a metaphysical principle, must face the question of whether the concept of will that it draws on for the power quanta is any less an ingredient added by human psychology than are the concepts of number, of the subject, or of motion. And if it eliminates all of these concepts, what does it still conceive? How have the quanta that are supposed to be characterized by the will to power to be defined? What process have we made? What progress have we made in our understanding if we no longer imagine power quanta obeying the laws of nature, but as commanding and obeying other power quanta, without our being able to say what commands and obeys? To say nothing of the difficulties that result from the dissolution of countable unities for the experimental cosmology that is known under the name of the eternal return, which, as Zarathustra knew, has number as its presupposition. A word more on the other option. Who could believe that Nietzsche, when he considered propounding what I have called an aristocrat's metaphysics in the persona of a lawgiver, did not have clearly before his eye the objections that he raised against the artist's metaphysics, Artistenmetaphysik, of his youth? How promising would it have been after the attempt of a self-critique of 1886, where he announced the break with the metaphysics to which he had recourse in the birth of tragedy, to offer again, under a different sign, the will that creates everything and reigns in everything. And how much orientation could a doctrine really have been able to give to the noble addressee that hammered into them, the world is will to power and nothing besides? A teaching that sees the will to power at work in the affirmation of life and in its negation, that detects it everywhere, not least in the will to nothingness. The philosopher knows that concepts are tools. What they are able to accomplish, what can be shed light on, thought, understood with their help, depends on how they are used, what they are employed for. If the will to power is supposed to be a solution to everything, it is no more than a name. It cannot become a light. It can become a light only for those who test it out in the circle of its applicability and for whom it was meant. Nietzsche rejected the will to power project in the course of 1888. He abandoned the book that had been announced and no longer turned his strength and attention to the teaching of the same name. He decided against the work that bore the doctrine in its title, and for a double work that pointed to Nietzsche himself in both of its parts. According to the will of the author, Ecce Homo was supposed to appear in 1889, with the Antichrist to follow a year later in this sequence, which is very important. The two books have as their subject the philosophic life and the philosopher, the determination of his task and his nature. Nietzsche's late decision confirms the rank order of his philosophy. The teaching of the will to power stands in the service of the self-knowledge of the philosopher. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Heinrich, for extremely powerful talk, which I'm still digesting. I have two questions. One is simple, and the second is a bit less simple. The first is you give a very clear account of how the suffering of the powerless leads them to take vengeance on the world by falsifying it, violating the phenomena, and imposing a moral order on the world itself. My first question, the simple one, is just this. Do you mean to suggest that those you called the noble addressees are also susceptible to this movement? The noble addressees as well as, say, those who Nietzsche sometimes calls the rabble? That's the simple question. The second one is, how does Nietzsche know that this is an imposition? How does he know that in seeing the world as essentially shot through with morality, one is doing violence to the world? How does he know that the world has a necessary character? By what argument does he establish that? Because as I'm sure you know, that's the thing that I don't see.
Okay. First, I would like to answer your question and to explain what I have said in my talk. And if you permit, I would later also make some remarks on your talk, because I was silent in the morning, and I have also to say something to your talk. Okay. So, I think you missed the point. You missed really the point. The addressee here is the philosopher, the wisest ones, and their will to truth, in which will to power is a problem. It's not about morality, the rebel, the nobles, etc. That is another question which I come to. But the important point is that it is here introduced as something which is of greatest importance for the so-called knower or the wisest one. Now, what is the problem? To make this very clear. If you are aware that in your will to truth there is this so-called will to power at work, then there is a clear indication or a clear awareness that you may force the issues, that your will to power is making things getting together which do not get together, that you are trying to bring about a system which doesn't work, to make it short. And it is introduced, the dysfunctionality is introduced in 220 on redemption with regard to this es war, it was. The will cannot change the es war. And that means not just time, as Heidegger says, but it means my own nature. The philosopher cannot change his nature. Nobody can change his nature, and you cannot change necessity. Now comes the dysfunctionality, which he calls the spirit of revenge, just twice and only there. What is the spirit of revenge? The will to power, which gets aware of its limitation, that it cannot change this es war and necessity, etc., brings in some other power which indirectly helps him to control what he cannot control. And that is the law-giving God. And that is the morality. So he explains it with the earliest, in 220, he explains it with the earliest, most famous quotation from Anaximander, which Heidegger, of course, is fond of. So, well, I think I have it in Nietzsche's own. I read it to you. Whence things have their origin, thence they have to perish, according to necessity, for they must pay penance to be judged for their injustice, according to time's order. So now necessity is interpreted in terms of injustice, which you have to pay for. That is, so to speak, the point. And he is talking about a philosopher. And other examples are Schopenhauer and so on. So he's really talking about the philosopher. And I think this is very important because it shows in terms of this will to power at work in the will to truth, a dysfunctionality which is of greatest importance to the philosopher. And therefore, he uses this word unharnessed of its folly. That is what we have to bring about, that we are not distorting the world as it is. And that is also his understanding of himself. I mean, Zarathustra now. Zarathustra comes and says, Overman, I teach you the Overman. And in 220, he understands, I mean, a lot happens. There's an enormous drama. He learns a lot with his disciples, and not understanding him. A noble youth, very important. In 1:8, he has this conversation with a noble youth, and then he introduces nobility and gives him, in 7 times he uses edel, 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 in order to calm this youth down, right? Because he sees the effect. All right, so he learns a lot, but in 220, he learns that he himself is talking about the nonsense of history so far, the nonsensical, the giant accident, etc., because he himself, as he says, I quoted it, could not live without as being a seer of a future which is redeeming this, which would mean that the Overman, to make it very plain, would have to redeem Socrates, or Rousseau, or Hegel, or so, because they are all unredeemed. This is absolutely untenable. And Zarathustra understands this. And this is the turning point of the whole thing. This is really of greatest importance. And this is then taking up in 230 when he uses this bifurcation. Right? You can use it. This is what I wanted to show. The concepts are not entities. They are instruments in order to tackle and handle a certain problem. And you can do it also with a passion of knowledge, which he, since dawn, uses again and again. And then you have it, of course, both, right? Self-control, it has to be self-reflective, etc. But that is the first thing one really has to understand. This is not a Weltanschauung, but it is a philosophical concept. and it has a certain meaning. Now to your question. He has, of course, the noble addressee. And this noble addressee may very well believe that the will to power is the solution to everything. Well, because he knows that he cannot be without faith. And he clearly says in What is Noble that the nobility is only possible in closed horizons. Closed horizons are impossible for the philosopher. I mean, this is such a fundamental thing that one should not always talk about the noble philosopher Nietzsche. This is what Nietzsche does with his rhetoric is very similar to what the Socratics do with the Kalos Kagatos. They are talking about the Kalos Kagatos and say Socrates is the Kalos Kagatos, and in the circle everybody is laughing about the Kalos Kagatos, right? So, and what does Nietzsche say in Beyond Good and Evil about in Ecce Homo about Beyond Good and Evil? There are two numbers, and in the second number he says, this is a book which is also addressing the gentilhomme. The gentilhomme is something like the gentleman, like the Kagara. So he knows what he's doing, right? And one should not, and so this is also a first answer to your morality question, we should not say, but he wants to have this noble and so on. Well, if he has a teaching for the nobles, that does not mean that he is there for the air of Christian morality. You know, this is not adequate. And if he were really such a confused thinker, I mean, I would not have studied him and taught 20 seminars about him and written 2 books about him, and Strauss would not have studied him all his life. I mean, then you would say, I'm done with Nietzsche. It's very simple, right? He didn't understand the most simple things. So that cannot be true. So that was part of my answer to you, but only part.
Thank you, Dr. Meyer, for a very intriguing talk. I have a small question about the Anaximander quotation.
I'm sorry.
Just a small question about what you laid so much stress on, which was the sort of purification of the will to truth from the desire for revenge or justice. And the Anaximander quotation that you used, that Heidegger uses and lays so much stress on, that Nietzsche had already referred to that in Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks. So very early on, he's already aware of that problem. I'm just wondering what was the change in his understanding of it, and aware of it as a problem for philosophy. So what was the change that occurred during the third period, Zarathustra?
Okay. So I refer to this periagoge, and it's absolutely, I'm very pleased that you ask about this. I think one has, following not only Nietzsche's indications, but if one goes through the work in a very careful way, one has to see that the Nietzsche of the Birth of Tragedy has not begun his philosophic life. To make it even more, let's say, to make it, to put it more explicit, at that time it was not even clear whether he would go into the direction of music, into the direction of classics, or into the direction of philosophy. And what he subscribed to in The Birth of Tragedy, what he called later Artistenmetaphysik, was a completely turned around concept from Schopenhauer, which he used in order to bring about, as he thought, a new culture for Europe. And Wagner and he would bring this about. The tragedy of the Greeks would be superseded by a higher kind of tragedy, and music would play an enormous role, to make it very short now. But this was also in terms of what he thought he could bring about as for culture. This was not a philosophic project. It was not a philosophic project. And also the four untimelies are very much and also the unpublished text on the pre-Socratics to which you referred, which he did not publish, but right after the birth of tragedy, he always is referring to the philosophers as quasi-kings, potential kings, legislators, great cultural figures, etc. And that means the philosopher was seen with regard to what he could do for Europe, Germany, Greek, and so on.
Okay,
And then he comes in a deep crisis. Everybody knows that. Wagner is just the starting point. Bayreuth is there. This is not his hopes, and so, etc. But that's not so interesting. The interesting thing is he sees that his ideals, his hope, had no real basis. And then you see the decisive question then is, how do you respond to such a failure, experience of failure? There is one possibility, let's say ordinary option is a new ideal. But for a philosophic mind, not yet leading a philosophic life, I make this distinction, it is not very sensible, because if this ideal didn't work, the next ideal may lead to the same disaster. So he had then this crisis, and he calls Human All Too Human the monument of a crisis, in which, as he says, he put all his ideals on ice. So this is a kind of epoche. You abstain from judgment about these things. And you say, I have to scrutinize everything, and especially those ideals I had before. I have to begin completely anew. And then he begins with his metaphors, going to the open sea. That's the metaphor for the beginning of the philosophic life. You don't know whether you will reach a territory, a land where you can live. You go to the open sea, whatever may happen. And only then, in Dawn, which is the first book after this crisis, in Dawn he uses the Leidenschaft der Erkenntnis, the passion of knowledge, will lead me wherever it may go. And before, in the second untimely, you all know it, or most of you know it, he is talking about the deathly truths, things which he thinks is true, but one should not go in that direction. One should hide it, should at best hide it to oneself. But if you follow the passion of knowledge, then you are no longer talking about deathly truth. And then the Nietzsche is really following this line till the end. So that's a long answer to your short question. I'm sorry.
It's a very helpful answer. Just if you could clarify it a little bit, because it is the case that in philosophy in the tragic age of the Greeks, he is talking about specifically philosophers, distinguishing them from artists, even though they have some things in common. And yes, he is introducing them as the peak of a culture, a very unusual culture. So what if I understand you right, you're saying that his understanding of philosophy changed, that he recognized philosophy as something distinct, and that was interested in questions that poets had been interested in, but really on the basis of nature already. And so the question of the one and the two comes up, the question of possibility of motion, deadly truths already, which have to be somehow covered over, concerning not only the origin of the world, but its principles. So how exactly did his understanding of the philosopher change? And are you saying that, I mean, because I grant that saying all it was, or time, is a problem. That he may mean necessity, he may mean nature. But in Zarathustra, he doesn't ever use the word nature, I don't believe.
Oh, that's not true.
He
In
uses it once.
217, he uses
Yes,
nature.
once, okay. But is that part of the change? Is because he uses nature already in the early work. So what exactly is the change? How would you characterize it?
Well, the change is about himself, how he understands himself. If somebody understands himself as being, so to speak, his task being to bring about something for the culture of the future of Europe, of Germany, or whatever, that is clearly not the same thing as something who says, I have to figure out what really the truth is. Whatever it may be, whether it's good for this culture, yes or no. This is the image of going to the open sea. You don't know whether it will be helpful to anybody, but you have to do it in order to get to the bottom of things. That's the thing. That's the beginning of the philosophic life. The beginning of the philosophic life has to be distinct. I mean, if somebody says, I have lived a philosophic life, but I don't know for how long, then obviously it was a philosophic life without self-awareness. That's not possible. So one of the helpful things of a crisis is that you are forced to make clear to yourself, what am I doing now? What kind of risk do I take? And that is what Nietzsche did. And other philosophers too. I don't want to go into other examples now, but I could, of course, because I have studied this for many years, this question. If we talk about a philosophic life, it does only mean something if we can say how it begins. I mean, if we cannot say that, if it is an amorphous thing, what does the concept mean? So you have to think about the beginning and about the end also. Can it end in a conversion, for instance? Is that a philosophic life? Or what is the end of the philosophic life? So, and that is for that, in that crisis, this I should add, Professor Arnsdorf was pointing to it yesterday in his talk, and he was very right to point to that. In that crisis, Socrates becomes so important to him. So in the center of on the birth of tragedy, in the very center, he criticizes Socrates for what? For the logondidounai. He asks for giving reasons. And that is destructive because this is, especially for people living in a closed horizon, may be very harmful, and this is how he sees it. And then when he is himself in the crisis, then exactly that question of logondidounai is what he is interested in. And then I taught a whole seminar where I went through all the references to Socrates from the unpublished earliest things till the very last writings. And you can see this dramatic change. And in this period of crisis, the Memorabilia of Xenophon become the book. Also in his letters to his friends, he says, this is now my dearest book, and so on. And Professor Arnsdorf was quoting that thing from Human All Too Human, where he says, hopefully the Memorabilia will one time, at one point, replace the Gospel or New Testament, right? So at that very time, he sees this is needed. I have to do this. I have to. And also the instinct doesn't help. In Ecce Homo, he says, it was eine Gesamtabirrung meines meines Instinkts, a total aberration of my instinct. That means if I see that it's possible that I have a total aberration of my instinct, then I cannot rely on my instinct. Then something else is needed. This is why then reasons are needed. You cannot say, oh, my instinct, it's not an entelecheia, and then at some point this philosopher comes out. No, no, no. It's a crisis, reasons, decisions, and scrutinizing the mistakes you made. That's crucial. And for instance, more to your point, perhaps, there is a letter, I quoted in this book, to one of his friends where he says, so far, I have admired these philosophers, those he wrote about, the pre-Socratics, and looked up to them. I lost a lot, but I have, on the other hand, won something new, because now I'm doing this myself, on my own ground. Before it was this kind of culture thing. Philosophers are important. I also want to be a philosopher, and I talk about the philosophers. And then this ideal is no longer working, but he is seeing something new, an experience which he did not have before, and which he expressed in this letter. Does that help? Okay. May I have more water? Could you have me?
I just want to follow up on Professor Burns's question and get a little bit more information about the philosophic break you refer to. So if I'm not mistaken, in Ecce Homo, Why I Write Such Good Books, The Untimelies, Section 2, he says, Schopenhauer's educator contains my understanding of the philosopher. And he also says Schopenhauer's educator is my past, Richard Wagner and Bayreuth is my future, Schopenhauer and Wagner, or in one word, Nietzsche. And he says you can replace every instance of the word Schopenhauer and Schopenhauer's educator with the word Nietzsche, and you can replace every instance of the word Wagner and Bayreuth with the word Nietzsche. And this comes in the context of him saying, there's where my understanding of the philosopher is. But you've said he's got a break where the old Birth of Tragedy and Untimelies, that's no longer his understanding of the philosopher. So it occurs to me that in his last autobiographical writing, he points back. It's also of note that to Georg Brandeis, he writes a letter and says, you should read Zarathustra, but you should take Schopenhauer's educator along with you for the sake of comparison. And so it seems to me that he doesn't depart as forcefully from the old view of the philosopher as you've given us to believe, given what Ecce Homo says in that section.
Well, okay. I mean, was not exactly my talk, but it was brought up, of course, this question about the periagoge. I can only recommend to you in this book, the chapter, The Crisis, it's in detail explained. And what Nietzsche does in Ecce Homo is these are not reviews of his books. He is not giving, so to speak, the content or his evaluation of the book as you should read it also, but he gives you a narrative of his development, and in this development, quite a number of let's say points are made in this way that he is saying one can see this, but at that point I was not aware of what it really meant. So I was talking about Wagner, and in fact, what I was talking about Wagner would only make sense for me. I took Wagner for myself. I misunderstood Wagner because I made him my self-portrait. That was Wagner. And Schopenhauer, to make it very clear, I mean, if you read Twilight of the Idols, Schopenhauer is clearly attacked as somebody who is no longer a philosopher. And in fact, he calls him a nihilist. And according to Nietzsche's understanding, a philosopher is not a nihilist. Right? So I cannot do this in detail now, but I have written about it so you can look whether the evidence is good or not.
Okay. Just let me kind of follow up. So you're saying that when he says, my understanding of the philosopher is contained in Schopenhauer's Educator, and it's leagues away from a Kant. I think that's the line. He says it's so far from a Kant. He's not being serious there. He doesn't think that the philosopher as portrayed in Schopenhauer's Educator is his understanding of the philosopher.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Thanks for your great talk. I'm interested in the character of the philosopher in Beyond Good and Evil as you presented it, and you focused on some of those later sections. I was curious about how it's connected with how Nietzsche presents the philosopher as the sort of commander and legislator, as giving the whither and the for what of humanity, or his earlier remarks in 62 and 63 on the great comprehensive responsibility of the philosopher for the spiritual health of humanity and so forth. I mean, there seems to be a kind of duality in the character of the philosopher that tears him or her in two different directions. That is, towards this. I mean, you pointed in this direction already, that there is that dual character. But I guess what I hear from your talk is that the philosopher, in its genuine guise, is the one that is the skeptic, is transcending, and its inauthentic guise is the sort of has that social responsibility. I guess my understanding would be that it's both. But so, I mean, do I have you right in that, in your reading what you said, and how would you
The first
view
part
these?
was
Yeah.
right, the second not.
Okay.
The crucial thing for this is I did not want to write this book on Zarathustra. I wanted to write the book on Ecce Homo and Antichrist. These two belong together in a very specific way. But then I noticed that it's impossible not first to present an interpretation of Zarathustra, because Zarathustra is really an experiment. He lives with this son, with this imaginary figure who is not Nietzsche, but who goes through, so to speak, a development. It's announced in the last paragraph, in the last aphorism of Book 4 of Gay Science. It's announced, as most of you, of course, know, incipit tragedia, and it's the whole the first number of what Zarathustra will present then. It begins as a tragedy, and then he experiments with something like a counter Jesus, not an antichrist, a counter Jesus, somebody who might replace Jesus and would be let's say, it could be something like the combination of a philosopher of a prophet in one person. And this man, full of love of mankind, as we have heard, goes down to the marketplace and gives this futurist teaching. You have to be redeemed, and I tell you how this redemption is possible. The overman, okay? And then he thinks through what is involved. And now comes something which really nobody in the whole literature paid attention to. Nietzsche publishes the first part. It's even without number 1. It is just as it is, just also sprach Zarathustra, no number, nothing. And no indication to be continued or so. He publishes it. That means he is forcing himself, compelling himself to do a life experiment with his Zarathustra. He cannot later change what he has published. And he cannot will against this es war. You see how important this is for the structure of the book. Then he writes the second part, and then he does exactly the same thing. He publishes it as it is, and then he is under this pressure of es war, which he cannot change. Then he writes the third part, and then the fourth part, and always publishing it before he starts the next thing. And then he thinks through in this figure, Zarathustra, is this possible? What is possible? What's not possible? And in 220, it becomes clear it is not possible, because the prophet is not just full of love of mankind and wants to help mankind, but he wants to help himself. He needs redemption. But a philosopher is not a philosopher if he is longing for redemption. That's the point. And this is what Nietzsche understands. This is the deepest meaning of self-sufficiency. If people talk about philosophers are self-sufficient, then of course people say, wow, we need a division of labor, etc. Nobody is self-sufficient. The deepest meaning of self-sufficiency is this thing. And if you are dependent on the future, that in 500 years or in 100 years or in 50 years, something will happen which redeems you, then you are not a philosopher. So then this thing unfolds, and then in the fourth book, what began as a tragedy ends as a comedy. And what never happens is what he thought first he would do, that Zarathustra will die. And he will die, so to speak, a death of sacrifice. And he had all kinds of thoughts how he could die. He could die because he was so overwhelmed by happiness, or he could die because of despair, because nobody would follow his teaching. Or one option was even he would be killed by the only women he thought as a character out of love, so to speak. And then he gives this all up. And Zarathustra gets older and older and older. And at the end, he is older than Socrates. Then it doesn't mean anything whether he dies or does not die or so. You see, it's just over. It's over. And after this experiment, Nietzsche cannot go on in the same way. Now he has figured out what is really possible for a philosopher and what is not possible. Then he can do, in an esoteric presentation, he can try to present something for his readers, and something which is for very few readers. And that is exactly what he's doing. And that the last two books are about this question. I mean, the Antichrist is not a book, just a polemic against Christianity. It is about the question, what is a philosopher? That is the real thing. And if you go through it and come to the end of the book, then you are, so to speak, led back to ex homo, to the beginning, where he is presenting the philosophic life. Therefore, the sequence is so important, that you begin with ex homo, which seems to be the means for the end, the revaluation of all values, and then you understand, no, the revaluation of all values was the means for the end, for how one becomes what one is according to one's nature. That is the meaning of how one becomes what one is, not how one becomes what one is now, at the moment or so. And therefore, this is a diet. These two books have to be understood together. And it is important how the sequence in which you read it. Now, your question about Beyond Good and Evil. This is also something Professor Werkley was thinking about and talking about this morning. I think that Professor Werkley is right to say that the free spirit, I mean, with this qualification, the very free spirit, who comes up only 3 times, as I said, preface, book part 2 and part 7, that is the real addressee. And the philosopher of the future, that is, so to speak, the humanitarian project. I give you something. The philosophers will do something for mankind. But Nietzsche will not be that. Nietzsche is interested in Nietzsche. and not in what the total fate of humanity in the next 10,000 years will be. You know? So that's, I think, is absolutely crucial. And Strauss points to that in a short remark. May these free spirits be more free than the philosophers of the future? I think you had that in mind this morning. And that's exactly this point. But that is Nietzsche's situation. He is interested in that. And what these philosophers of the futures may do or not, if they are philosophers, then they will do the right thing for them.
Thank you. I like your focus on the philosopher, and I wanted to ask about the image of philosophy that you build, especially, I think, upon your attention to section 230 of Beyond Good and Evil. I think if you flip the page, you might have to qualify what you said. That is, 231 seems to indicate that there are limitations to founding life on reasons. Especially this, right, that learning can't change us entirely. And it can't, about certain things that I think Nietzsche calls fundamental problems. There are predetermined answers in us, and we can't do anything to change those things. So how would that modify what you're saying about the completely open horizon of philosophy?
There are two different questions. At the end of 230, there is this question, why do we do it? And, well, I have the book, so. That's a different question from your fundamental problems. So let's see, 230.
Does it just say, why have knowledge at all?
Well, I want to quote correctly in this case. So at the end he says, what is the answer? Why knowledge at all? That's the question at the end. And then he says, wir fanden und finden keine bessere Antwort. And then we did not find and don't find a better answer. And then he has 4, not 3, 4 points. And so I think the answer is no better answer than our nature. That is the reason. Our nature is the answer to why we want to have knowledge. And that goes together, as I said, with the beginning of his philosophical life, when he then is referring to the passion of knowledge. That is his nature. And the most important statement of Nietzsche about his understanding of the philosopher his, so to speak, his last word is Antichrist 54. And Antichrist 54 is about, there he brings in Zarathustra and calls him a skeptic, in order to make clear he is not the prophet. At the end, he is not the prophet, but a skeptic. And then he's talking about the convictions. And our convictions are, so to speak, something like food, which we have to work on and to overcome. And he says there is this despotic force in us. That's the passion of knowledge, which goes on and on. He calls it despotic and enlightening. Why can it be despotic and enlightening? Because it is the passion of knowledge. That is a passion which defines this nature. This is the definition of the nature of the philosopher. Or whether the philosopher then is really taking this step or that step, or makes mistakes, or may always be professor in Basel and never really begin his philosophic life, that is a different question. There is no teleology. This is also made clear by Nietzsche. The key words for ecce homo, for understanding what is going on in this life, is task, Aufgabe, and Erholung. Task and Aufgabe and Erholung. And Erholung seems to be just something in order to make task possible. But if you think it through and develop it, then you will see there too, the means is in fact the end and not vice versa. But without this task and the right task, this nature will not develop. So if he says how one becomes what one is according to one's nature, one does not become it like a plant developing and everything comes from this nature and unfolds. But there is this element, you may have the wrong task, and then you will never come to become what you are. Then you will never fulfill your potential, right? So it is, and you see now the task is discussed in the second book, the revaluation of all values. But in that book, if I may just add that, in the second book, Antichrist, revaluation of all values comes up only twice. The very last line of the whole book and the last line of paragraph 13. No, the beginning of paragraph 13, where he says, we are already the revaluation of all values. That's the key. We are already, I mean, we philosophers are already the revaluation of all values. It's not something to be brought about in the next 100 years. This is also why Nietzsche can say in Ecce Homo, great victory. The revaluation is complete. The revaluation is complete when it is written. That is for him also done. It's no longer the question whether it will have this fate or that fate, you see? So I think that's crucial for his self-understanding. And the fundamental problems you refer to, that's a different thing. The fundamental problems are, so to speak, independent, are out there, so to speak, whether they are understood by the philosopher or not understood by the philosopher, seen or not. The fundamental problems are the fundamental problems. They wait to be dealt with. So, in any case, the instinct will not be enough. That Ecce Homo makes so clear. If you say Gesamtabirrung meines Instinkts, that is farewell to all hope on instinct will lead you. That doesn't work.
Well, thank you, Professor Meyer. I found your talk very helpful. I just want to go back to your comments on Zarathustra. Nietzsche at one point says he regards it as his greatest gift to humanity. You have characterized it as a failure. I mean, the account, in one sense anyway, in terms of what the task it was initially and how it ended up in the fourth part. So could you explain, is that remark of Nietzsche ironic? Or am I perhaps I'm misunderstanding the remark?
Well, this is a little bit more complicated now. I'm sorry that I have to say more than you may ask me to say. So there is this complication. Let me begin this way. Nietzsche had this thought, and we know this from his letters, which he wrote through these 3 years to Overbeck and to others, that the book would not be complete without something he called Mittag. And that is not in part 1 and in part 2 and in part 3, but it is the center in part 4, Mittags. And that's about his description of Zarathustra's happiness. And he wanted to write this, but and to publish it. He wrote it and he wanted to publish it, but no publisher was willing to publish it because Zarathustra was the greatest failure of his career. His publisher printed 1,000 copies of each part, and of the third part, only 50 copies circulated. And that was 30 of them or so he made gifts to other people. So almost nobody bought it. And the publisher was sitting there on 950 copies and said, no fourth part, please. So Nietzsche thought about what to do, how he could publish it, and then he decided to print 45 copies. That was roughly the number of copies he made. He had, which were sold of the third part, and he published it or printed it and made it gifts to people. But it was not published. It was not available. But he quoted even from it in the preface to Birth of Tragedy. He quotes it, and also in Ecce Homo he quotes it. But he thought when he was writing Ecce Homo that the book, because it was not published, could be postponed, so to speak, 20, 30 years. Let's see how the first 3 volumes of Zarathustra will really be received. So he says to Peter Gass, please collect all the copies you have and ask everybody to give the copy back. We will publish it only in 20 years. So, you see? So that would mean that in Ecce Homo he thought, and in Ecce Homo he says only 3 parts. He is not talking about the fourth part explicitly. He has a quotation at a certain point to make it clear it does exist, but he speaks only about the 3 parts. So he thought that book could have a certain effect, the 3 volumes. But the 4th volume, well, in a way you can say it didn't do harm. Many people still read it as his Bible, right? And don't see the irony at all, and don't see the comedy, and just think it is the 4th part can be dismissed. But I think that is, to make it short, my answer to your question.
Other questions?
I would like to ask to say something, and that is to my good friend Dustin Siebel. Because this morning you attacked me, and therefore I think I have the right to answer, to respond. And you did not only attack me, but you attacked Strauss, but you don't know that you did that. So I take it all on me. You said natural theology is a concept which is not really, I put it mildly, which is not really doing the work it is supposed to do by those people who are talking about it. Okay? And you said something like, the presupposition is that we have certain ideals or ideas, I don't know which word you used, and then that is presupposed. And therefore, this natural theology argument doesn't work. Now I want to try to explain what this argument means, because I really think you didn't understand it. Natural theology, number 1, doesn't mean natural theology as the theologians talk about it. So it does not mean a kind of theology which goes to nature and refers to nature in order to prove the existence of God, masterminding, so to speak, everything in nature. That is the traditional concept of natural theology. This, of course, is not meant. Natural theology means something very specific as I use it, and as Strauss sometimes uses it, sometimes not. So it is a philosophic theology in this sense. It focuses on the question, what is a God? That is the question, what are the criteria that have to be fulfilled in order to say that an exemplar is belonging to the species we call God? And this is, so natural theology is focusing on the question, quid est Deus? So we do not presuppose by that we have some ideas about how God should be, but we begin all these arguments, you said the 1 million question today, right, is the answer. Okay, if you don't have an answer, then please listen to answers which are given. So, all possible answers, all possible refutations have to be ad hominem arguments. They have to be elenchical, because you cannot base philosophy on any axiom or on a system or on such a thing. So you have only the possibility of refuting the most important, the strongest, the most powerful objection to philosophy. That you have to search out. And I think there we agree, of course, but I have to explain what is at stake here. So that means whatever you do, whether you do it with Socratic dialectics focusing on justice, on the thoughts people have about justice, or whether you do it with regard to somebody who says, I'm not really interested in justice, but in security, there must be something which gives meaning to my life, whatever it is, right? There are different points of view which are given to you as supporting the alternative which you have to refute. And in all these cases, the refutation can only work if you address something the other side says and grants. We agree about that too. Okay. So in this case, the other side says that God is the most perfect being. That is the ad hominem argument. Then, of course, the other person has to say, what is the most perfect being? Then the other side has to give some attributes, whatever it is. But nobody believes in the Deus absconditus, in a completely hidden God. Nobody believes in that. But all people who believe in a God who is wise or good or just, pitiful or whatever, right? But they believe in something and not in nothing. And in this case, and this is in Thoughts on Machiavelli, very important thing when he's talking about the ontological proof of existence, and he is discussing this. And there he points to this thing, that it is not the existence is the problem, but the perfection is the problem. And so this natural theology approach separates the question of existence from the question of quality. So it does not ask for any faith, of course. It asks for thinking through the criteria, right? That is, and that is what this is all about. Of course, I can explain it more, but now I would like to say why you are also doing injustice to Strauss. From Thoughts on Machiavelli on, I'm absolutely sure about this. This was for Strauss an enormous, important subject. In Thoughts on Machiavelli, I published about that. Everybody can read it. That argument, I think, is made. But then, immediately after that, in 1959, he publishes in What is Political Philosophy, the Hobbes essay on the basis of Hobbes' political philosophy with an extended footnote. The thing was published in French in 1954, but the footnote, the extended footnote, not the whole footnote, but the extension of 20 lines or so, is new. And Strauss points to it twice in the preface to the Hobbes book in 65 in Germany and in the new edition of Natural Right and History, that only there he figured out the real argument or reasoning of Hobbes, and he points to that footnote. And that, I think, is also about this subject, and he understood that in Hobbes because he understood it in Thoughts on Machiavelli. Then he goes on. He follow this. This theme is then his new project is Aristophanes. Immediately after Thoughts on Machiavelli, for the next couple of years, he is studying Aristophanes. And in between, he is publishing How to Begin to Study the Guide of the Perplexed in 1963. Then there is the same problem. Then in 1964, The City and Man ends with a question, quid sit Deus, which is a reference, which is not the original Latin, but is indirect speech, referring to the Natura Deorum Cicero. And then the next book after City and Man, and in that book he also asks the question. He says Socrates did not ask that question, what is a god? He says that. And then the next book, Socrates and Aristophanes, is so to speak the whole book about this question. And then after that he immediately writes Notes on Lucretius, immediately after that. And that is the end point, so to speak, of this whole development. But the guiding thread of this is this question, what is a god? So obviously Strauss did not think that it is an insignificant argument or it would be just curiosity or something, but it was very important. And of course I could say much more about it, but I don't want to be boring to you. In any case, I think, because you brought it up, I should at least say I defend it. And if my book on Strauss will be finished, then I hope you will see how important it is in Strauss.
Well, I already said I wasn't invited to this conference. I already said I wasn't invited to the conference, and I didn't write the panel titles, and maybe I should add I didn't write the paper. I did warn you, though. I'm a hopeless, incorrigible Bruellian, so at least I prepared this. I fully accept that the question, the fundamental question, can helpfully be put as, what is a god? That is, what are the divine attributes? I think the disagreement consists in the how. That is, how do you go about answering that question? Directly, as you suggest, or by a more indirect route. I think I mentioned before in Dawn 91. In Dawn 91, Nietzsche concludes that aphorism by taking up Pascal and the hidden God. And he says of Pascal that he never sufficiently raised the question to himself why this God is partially hidden. And it's interesting, he says partially, not simply or completely hidden. And I think that's very telling, because it seems to me the faithful can give the answer to the philosopher who proceeds along the route you suggest, that the perfection of God exceeds human reason. That human reason is unable to grasp the fullness of God's perfection. That's not to say God is entirely hidden from us. One might have some sort of divination of that perfection, a divination which falls short of speech in various ways. But it seems to me that that's a very powerful response to the philosopher. So just to bracket the Strauss, if we got into that, that would take us too far afield. Just to focus on the question itself, it seems to me that the philosopher loses common ground with the believer the minute the philosopher says, no, you need to be absolutely clear, what do you mean by perfection? Because the believer, I think, by his own account, doesn't need to be absolutely clear about that. And I'll just mention one case in the history of philosophy in which this comes across most powerfully, or particularly powerfully, in Hume's dialogues concerning religion. There's a believer who believes that God can be and needs to be demonstrated to reason by way of natural theology. Faith is not enough, according to this fellow. His name's Cleanthes. But interestingly, as the discussion proceeds, and as Philo, who stands in for Hume in this dialogue, refutes him again and again and again, and shows that reason cannot ever grasp God, Cleanthes retreats and ultimately takes the position that, yes, human reason cannot appreciate God's providence. Nonetheless, precisely in failing to appreciate God's providence fully and completely, God's providence shines through, and we have a kind of experience of his presence. And I think that retreat into a kind of almost personal experience of God is very powerful. And I don't see how, on your view, you can dispense with that without losing the common ground that I know we both think is crucial to have this kind of conversation.
Okay, may I answer this? I said before, the perfection is not just, again, an idea, but the perfection has, of course, to be articulated. If the other side says perfect, then what does that mean? So the attributes have to come in. And now you say, you take wisdom, take goodness, justice, whatever it may be. You will have always the same experience. I really address your objection. At a certain point, whatever the attribute is you are discussing, the other person will say, yeah, but there is something which we cannot answer. Wisdom, justice, goodness, whatever it may be. And it is miraculously possible because the omnipotent God cannot be denied. Okay, then you know that this is an exit strategy. It is a strategy to stop the discussion. And you always say, because we only have partial knowledge, we cannot explain anything, we cannot say what it is, and then you stop the discussion. And if you have seen that again and again, then you know something. That is my first answer. And the second answer about the experience is a very important thing, and Strauss discussed it in the preface with Buber. In the preface to the Spinoza book. I just taught it, the autobiographical preface, so I know it quite well. And Buber, of course, and Rosenzweig, they claim to have absolute experience. And then Strauss, it's an enormously important paragraph, which also brings in Heidegger in a certain way. I don't develop this now. But the crucial thing is, Strauss says, what is the experience? If you say more than you heard the call, if you say it is, and then he says, if he says it's not the experiencer, it is the wholly other, or it is death and nothingness, there Heidegger comes in, you give an interpretation. All these things are interpretations. And now comes the ad hominem argument again. that person who says that there is this experience has the utmost interest, should have the utmost interest to figure out what that experience really means. Because if somebody says, I experienced the call and it said, destroy the Twin Towers, it has enormous consequences, right? So, yeah, but that's the point. And Strauss is also discussing with Scholem this thing again and again, and he says, your friends, the Kabbalists, what do they really experience? And then Scholem says, well, their experience is, of course, channeled by the Jewish tradition, what they believed before. Okay, then you know already what is going on. The experience itself, you can claim an experience, but you can also say to the other person, everything you say about it is your interpretation. And that interpretation must, for you, to check that interpretation is for you of the utmost importance, not for me.
Can I respond?
Yes, of course.
We're over. That's all right. I don't know who's running this conference anyway. But how do you know it's an exit strategy? In Anselm, Saint Anselm at one point says he's tried to defend the view that God is merciful, and he's also tried to defend the view that God is just. And after realizing that these two attributes seem not to go together, he concludes by saying, God, help me understand what I'm saying, because it doesn't make sense. And you could say that's an exit strategy. But you could also say, despite the fact that what he's saying, and he knows this, that despite the fact that what he's saying is not entirely or fully coherent, he nonetheless does have an experience, and a genuine experience of the divine. It seems to me that how can you leap to the conclusion that this is a false interpretation of a genuine experience rather than a genuine experience? And partly I ask because just thinking about Socrates' own activity, he doesn't typically have the kind of conversation that you've outlined, where about God's perfection. I think the exception is with a believer. The exception is, in a way, the laws, but that's not Socrates. So I'm just not sure how you can be certain that it's an exit strategy because they lack the experience rather than a genuine experience that you're not understanding because you're obtuse or greedy or an Epikuros.
Okay, two very short answers. Why do you say it's a genuine experience? How do you know that it is a genuine experience? I mean, the genuine experience, there may be an experience of something, but of what? I mean, if somebody says, I feel very well, that is an experience, and then you say, I don't deny it. But if somebody says, I feel something which leads me, which makes me ask you to do such and such, then you have the right to ask that other person why that should be the case, right? So the genuine experience is not the problem. The interpretation of this experience is the problem. Whether something follows from it, whether you become a prophet and say, here is what you have to do. Also, that is the problem, not a beautiful experience. And the other point, very short answer to that, Socrates was not confronted with a claim of a Deus absconditus and of an omnipotent God. There is no omnipotent God. They may say Zeus is almighty, but he is not almighty. So that's a different thing, right? It's really a different issue.
I don't want to take more time, and I certainly don't want to have the last word, because I think that would be very impolite. But I think that this is we've boiled this down to our disagreement down to its core, I think, for all to see, including me, which is very helpful. Thank you, Heinrich Meier, for coming and ending this conference on such a high note. We're all very appreciative, and thanks also to all of the other participants. We appreciate your presence and contributions very much.